Hi, all. This is Professor Ian again. Welcome to part two of my lecture on the themes and big ideas of the Odyssey. This is where we left off last time, talking about Arete and Penelope. So I just wanted to finally think about, in terms of the Odyssey, the difference in theme, what the Iliad and what the Odyssey are about. The Iliad is about war. Is it about the problems with war, or is it about kind of valorizing war and thinking about the idea of death above dishonor that Achilles lives by? Is Achilles right? That's kind of the big question of the Iliad. Is he right to do all this? Is Hector right to do all this? Even though for both of them it costs him everything, right? For Hector, it costs him his family, his son, his wife, and his life. Achilles also cost him his life, cost him his best friend Patroclus, his family, and everything that he could have lived for back home. So they both sacrifice everything for honor. And the question is that right? Is that right? I mean, people still talk about Achilles, right? So he did succeed in making his name live forever, right? But was he right? That's the kind of theme of one of the big questions of the Iliad. And also this idea of fighting against fate, the idea of fate and the role, the interplay of the gods and the humans in the Iliad, which also comes through in the Odyssey, right? So that's a similar theme in both. Is Odysseus, is it his own fault that he doesn't get back home for 10 years of the journey, or is this the winds of fate as personified by the gods? Um, you know, in a sense, it is caused by his foolishness, but is that just the gods punishing him for this, or is this his own fault? And the journey involves Odysseus learning to avoid temptation, right, and learning to master every situation and trust in Athena. So piety, cleverness, adapting to new challenges. So a very different kind of overcoming of obstacles than Achilles. Achilles doesn't learn to adapt and use his cleverness and intelligence to overcome the challenges of life. Rather, he gets revenge after Patroclus is killed. He has to live by his heroic code and go and fight Hector at that point only, right? So we have a different kind of hero in the Odyssey. By the end of the book, a very different kind of hero comes through. So if you read the Greek of the Odyssey, you're going to see that a lot of times he's described with the epithet Poly, especially Polymetus, which means a possession of intellect and social skills. Polyteles, capable of enduring many things. Polymekanos, profoundly brilliant. These are ways to translate it. Poly, I don't even know how to pronounce that. Polykilometus, um, dapple skilled, so having this wide variety of adaptable skills that he can bring to bear on any situation. So if you read the Greek, there is a lot of him being described in this way, that he has these multiple talents, right? Whereas Achilles is not usually described that way. Achilles is very much the personification of that heroic code. I mean, part of the heroic code, as we saw in the Iliad, is singing and being in touch with his emotions, which is kind of surprising, I think, for modern readers. But it all ties in with this Greek idea of the ideal hero. Whereas again, Odysseus seems to embody a combination of skills outside of that. He is a great warrior, especially as we see at the end. If you read the scene with the suitors and the bow, he's the only one strong enough to cock this special bow that he has, and then he goes ahead and murders dozens of capable young men. Right? These are not wimps that he's murdering. These are all some of the leading men of the area. So these are good warriors in their own right, and he goes ahead and slaughters them with no mercy. So he's a good warrior, but he's also has all these other skills. And Metis, we can define as cunning intelligence, artifice, stratagem, right? So this kind of cleverness that Odysseus has, right? So we can think about, is this a skill that's really lauded in the Iliad? Not so much, right? Is Achilles known for his metis? No. And who else has this in the Odyssey? Well, Penelope has this, as we see with her stratagem keeping the suitors away. The heroic people in the Odyssey all seem to have this kind of cleverness, and we'll see this in a number of ways. There's a scene when Odysseus is debating what to do with his right hand man, and Odysseus is very clever, and his right hand man is very blunt about things. And Odysseus's men, especially on the island of Helios, with the island of the where they eat the cattle that is owned by the sun god. They make that very foolish mistake. They're not very clever, and Odysseus is able to survive because he's more clever. So this is what one of the things that Odysseus has, in addition to being a great warrior and embodying all these other things that are important to the Greek tradition. Just a little bonus meme. So I just wanted to end by talking a little bit about what's happened to everybody else after the Trojan War. This is called the Nostoi, and there was apparently a whole book about this, right, that came between the end of the Trojan War and the beginning of the Odyssey. It's mostly we don't have much left of it, but it chronicles the what happened to the rest of the great Greek heroes after the war and when they tried to return home. So Nostoi is the plural form of homecoming. Nostos is the singular. It just means homecoming. So the Odyssey is the story of Odysseus's Nostos, his homecoming. Or here's another example: Agamemnon does not get his Nostos, his homecoming. I mean, he returns home, but he's murdered right away. So he doesn't really get his homecoming in the same way that Odysseus does. Odysseus is able to return home in a glorious fashion. So some of the heroes that we saw in the Iliad, Diomedes, if you read book 5, it wasn't assigned, but he actually wounds one of the gods. He returns to Argos after the war, and he finds out his wife's been unfaithful, and he leaves. He ends up founding some other cities on the Italian peninsula, but he doesn't have the same kind of homecoming that Odysseus does. He finds that his home is not what he remembered it to be. Ajax the Lesser. So there's two Ajaxes at Troy, and Ajax the Lesser is the scoundrel of the two. He's the one he rapes Cassandra in Athena's temple during the sacking of the city. So this is a terrible offense to the gods, of course, and he is wrecked by in a storm by the gods, and then killed by Poseidon specifically because he is wronged the gods. Which is, there's a bit of irony here because in one version of the Medusa story, Poseidon rapes Medusa in Athena's temple, and then here we have Poseidon getting mad at this mortal who does basically the same thing or a similar thing in Athena's temple. So maybe there's a bit of irony, but there are also different versions of the myth, right? This is Homer's version of the gods, and the rape of Medusa in Athena's temple is best found in Ovid, so it wouldn't necessarily be what Homer is thinking about when he's writing this about Poseidon killing someone for wronging the gods in this way. Otherwise, it might seem like a bit hypocritical, right? Like, why would Poseidon be mad at this guy when he did the same thing? But anyways, Ajax the Lesser has a bad end, which is good because he was a bad guy. Ajax the Greater, who's a greater warrior and more famous. When people talk about Ajax, they talk about Ajax the Greater. He actually committed suicide before they left Troy because he was not awarded Achilles' armor, Hector's armor, sorry, during the games. So when he's dishonored in this way, he commits suicide. Odysseus is the one who gets the armor, and if you want to see that, there's also in book 11 of the Odyssey, Odysseus has to talk with Ajax, and it's kind of awkward. So, but anyway, so that's what happened to Ajax the Lesser. Agamemnon, as I said, he's the war chief of the Greeks. He's the one in the beginning who's fighting with Achilles. He returns to his city of Mycenae. He brings back Cassandra as one of his war prizes. There's a great play about this if you're interested. Sophocles wrote the play Agamemnon, Aeschylus. Sorry about that. He wrote the play Agamemnon, which is all about his return home and murder by Clytemnestra, which is Clytemnestra was his wife, right? She murders him while he's taking a bath. when he returns. So he doesn't have a great homecoming. He returns home, but then he's murdered right away. And Clytemnestra is angry with him because he sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia in order to gain winds to sail to Troy after he angers Artemis. It seems like Agamemnon angers a lot of gods, right? So, anyways, when he returns home, he's killed. This is just the mask of Agamemnon. This is, one of the common practices of the era was a death mask for the great rulers, right? So it's a gold mask in the shape of his likeness, or close to it. It was discovered in 1876, and some people think this is, the birth or the burial chamber of Agamemnon. They're dating it to about 1600 BCE. Fascinating story about this if you want to look into it some more. Anyways, Idomeneus, we didn't really talk about him much. He returns to Crete to find that his wife has been unfaithful. He again is driven out. There's various versions of that. Anyways, it's not a good end for him. Menelaus, here's someone who is more important to us. He's the one who was married to Helen, and he's the one who's been wronged by Paris, and the whole reason for the war in the first place. There's different versions of what happens to Menelaus and Helen after they leave, because he does regain Helen after the fall and sacking of Troy. There's different versions, some where they go to Egypt for years, some where they return home to Sparta. It takes them 7 years to get back, but they make it back and resume their life. So there are different versions of that story, but he does end up getting Helen and returning. And then Neoptolemus, this is the son of Achilles. He isn't part of the Iliad. He appears in later. He appears after the Iliad. He arrives in Troy to help fight. So Achilles has his son fighting with him at one point. So he takes Hector's wife as a slave back with him. It doesn't end well for him. He was kind of a bad guy too. He's, this picture, this is Hector's son. This is a pretty gruesome version of the death of Priam. This is Priam, Hector's father. This is Hector's son. This is Neoptolemus beating Priam to death with his grandson's body. So it's pretty gruesome. Hector's son, in most versions of it, did not survive the sacking of Troy. In some versions, he's thrown from the city walls, which were quite high. Remember, this is a very well-fortified city, so thrown, 40 feet off the top of the wall to his death. In this version, a much more gruesome version of that. But he was not a good guy, and he did not have a good end. You'll notice that there's a pattern there where the worst of the Greek heroes don't have good ends. Finally, Nestor, and he returns to his home city of Pylos safely. So he's actually allowed his nostos. He survives and returns home happily. But he was an old, peaceful, pretty good guy in the book, right? He doesn't beat people to death with their grandsons' bodies or anything like that. So you can see there's a kind of like moral judgment in some of these nostoi that happen, right? Agamemnon is not a very good person. He has this beef with Achilles and doesn't seem very reasonable at times. So he doesn't end well. Menelaus kind of middling, right? But he isn't a huge player in the Iliad, even though the whole thing centers around how he was wronged. And then a character like Nestor, who is a good character and he's always cautioning, like temperance and calmly dealing with problems, is able to return home safely because he did not anger the gods in the same way as some of the other characters did, like Ajax the Lesser or some of the other ones. So anyways, that's just an overview of some of the heroes after the Trojan War. As kind of background to thinking about Odysseus' own return. It was very fraught trying to get back to your home city after this war. Remember, sea travel for the Greeks was not, we think about, if we were to fly from Asia Minor to Greece, we wouldn't think anything of it. It'd be like, okay, let's take Ryanair. It'll cost about $50. But for the Greeks, this was a fraught journey, especially if the gods are against you. Okay, and that's it for now. Enjoy the Odyssey.